Turn off the lights. Wear your headphones. Welcome to the Darkstory. The house smelled like rain and old paper, but the thing that woke Mara in the dark was the sound of someone standing very still in the next room. So still that the silence itself had weight. It was not a footstep. It was not a breath. It was the metallic pause between heartbeats, the cutaway hush that arrives when a clock stops and a living room becomes a stage. She lay there counting the spaces between the silence and told herself it was nothing, an animal, the pipes, the house settling, until the silence answered back with a slow scrape, as if fingernails had traced the plaster where the wallpaper had peeled. Mara had moved back to her childhood home because grief had no better address. After her brother Jonah's funeral 6 months before, the city apartment had become a mausoleum of memory. Curtains that held his smell, a mug he'd chipped, a toothbrush and a cup on the sink. Her therapist had said small changes help, so she packed a single suitcase, a stack of photos, and a borrowed courage, and drove 3 hours north to the house at the edge of town where she'd grown up. The place where the birch trees kept their vigil and the road ended in gravel and quiet. She told herself returning would stitch the torn edges of her days back together. The house agreed at first, folding her in like a glove. The house was older than the town's census and newer than the map. It had architectural shame, rooms that never fit under one roof, gables that argued with each other, like a body stitched from parts that refused to remember they'd once been whole. It smelled of dust and lemon oil and the faint residue of the people who had lived there long enough to leave fingerprints on the wood. Light came through the windows in hesitant bands. At noon, the kitchen looked like a photograph left too long in the sun. At night, everything changed. The dark collected in corners, and the house made soft, bureaucratic noises. The attics exhale, the basement's small grudges. Those nocturnal murmurs were expected. The thing that wasn't expected was how the home learned to speak in other tones. The first oddity arrived in a box. Mara found it on the dining table the morning after she moved in. A worn shoebox of letters and Polaroids she didn't remember owning. Jonah's handwriting curved across envelopes in his messy, economical script. There were postcards from places he never visited, and a photograph, grainy, blurred, of a woman with hollowed cheeks and a hairline that looked not like anyone she knew, but like a map of some unhappy coastline. The photograph made the air thinner. Mara thumbed the edges and tasted copper. She told herself she was still tired, that grief fiddled with perception, and put the box on the shelf. That night the silence returned, but this time it was punctuated. A single note on the kitchen clock, as if someone had hit the rim of a glass. Mara rose, the boards complainting beneath her, and walked toward the sound. The hallway light flickered. The next room contained nothing but a shadow that belonged to the doorway, an absence that was more articulate than any object. As she walked past, the shadow stretched, reached a finger of black across the floor, and licked her ankle with the cold taste of expectation. She felt watched, and not by eyes but by a listening that wanted to be known. She started sleeping with the lamp on, then with all the lamps on. She left the radio on for company, and found she preferred its static to the quiet. She closed windows she felt she had closed. Yet the house seemed to collect presence like rainwater. The attic's breathing became deeper, a distant chorus from within the walls. Objects shifted. A mug on the counter moved 2 inches. A chair turned a fraction toward the window. A towel that had been folded was undone, as though someone had stood and thought and then left. Nothing violent at first. It was the preface page of a novel written in small, deliberate edits. Mara confided in the town's only barista, a woman named Lila, who kept her eyebrows like tiny punctuation marks. "Maybe it's the house," she said, and slid a biscotti across the counter as if sharing a secret. Old places keep scores. Mara wanted this to be a quaint superstition she could tuck away. It refused. One night, the bedside lamp went out after a soft, pocket-sized cough by the headboard. There was a note on the pillow. Jonah. The name in the note looked like a child's press of clay, not written but impressed, as if the ink had been pressed into the fibers by an absent hand. She checked the house top to bottom but found no explanation. The camera she'd purchased, simple, consumer grade, more ritual than science, showed nothing. In the footage, there were only black frames and a flicker where the lamp had died, a smear of light that did not resolve into shape. She replayed the clips until the pixels wore thin, and the room on the screen took on a life she recognized. Angles of the wallpaper she had scrubbed with lemon oil that morning, the same dust on the shelf, the same crooked nail in the molding. In the footage, the air itself seemed to thicken at the doorway, like syrup pouring out of a jar and pooling on the floor. Then the image cut to black. Sleep became a threat. By day, she wandered through town, answering questions she didn't mean to. How are you? Keeping busy? She avoided the cemetery. The rows of markers had become a forest of blank names, and the flowers were just plastic offerings. At home, the house spoke in smaller keys. It hummed near the kitchen sink, and a whisper skimmed the tiles. Once she found her mother's old recorder on the counter playing a single note in a loop, low, human adjacent, until she smashed it beneath her heel to stop the sound. When she bent to pick up the pieces, a scrap of paper fell from the broken plastic, an address in a handwriting she knew very well. Jonas, her brother's nickname in every boyhood letter, had never lived at that address, but her feet remembered the road in a way her conscious mind did not. Against better judgment, she went to the address. The street was a sleeve of suburb, houses arranged like stern people in line, each with its own manicured silence. Number 18 had a mailbox sagging like a tired jaw. The front door, unlatched, gave to a house that smelled of mildew and something older, like the inside of a mouth. The floorboards here sang hollow songs, paint peeled like scab. There were photos on the mantel, faces blurred by time, and a child's tin soldier on a shelf, with a face gouged away. On the kitchen table, an envelope bore Jonah's name in the same impressed script. Inside the envelope was one photograph, the same woman, her eyes now perfectly sharp, deep as wells. She wasn't smiling, alive. By the time Mara left the house, the sky had turned the color of old bruises. She hadn't meant to take the photograph, but it creased in her palm like a confession. That night the house, as if jealous, escalated. It brought voices into the rooms, low and indistinct at first, like a radio tuned between stations. Then clarity cut through. Phrases Jonah had said, tiny loops of his laugh, an argument they had when they were 16 about whether to leave or stay, a confession he had made about a girl named Mara, her own name spoken to her like a secret. The voice came from the attic now, a place previously only used for dust and found things. The attic door was not locked, but she'd never opened it before. Standing at its threshold, she heard a rhythm like tapping. 3 soft knocks, then 2, then a long staccato that matched her pulse. She climbed with a flashlight clenched between her teeth and found a room full of maps, of the town and then of the town again with red circles and lines she didn't yet understand. Scrawled on the floorboards with something dark were names, dozens of them, and beside each name a date, some scratched out and written over, as if someone had been revising a ledger of lives. Jonah's name was there, carved smooth by the repetition of some patient hand. Under it, in a different script, neat and foreign, was the phrase, deeper darkness. That phrase should have been just words to be erased with detergent and sunlight. Instead, they smelled like iron and rain. For the next week, the house's behavior congealed into a narrative. Things happened as if they were being written by an unseen author, with a cruel sense of timing. A chair tipped over toward the door, a child's laugh that seeped from the pipes, the mirror fogging with the shape of a face that was not hers. The townspeople stopped stopping by. Leela told her the house had a look now when she passed, like a person who knew where trouble lived. Mara wrote in a notebook, lists, dates, small attempts to impose logic. The notes grew erratic. The first twist arrived on a rainy Tuesday. The photograph of the woman she'd taken from the dilapidated house reappeared at her kitchen table. She had kept it in her pocket. She had not left the house since the drive back. The woman in the photo now clutched a smaller photograph in her hands, a picture of Mara sleeping, hair fallen across her pillow. A corner of the Polaroid showed the edge of Mara's lamp, the blue ceramic she'd purchased in the summer, proof that something was inside the house that could mimic angles, recreate light, fold time like a page between its fingers. The woman's eyes, blurred before, were now sharp and set on Mara, as if she had only been waiting for the right lens to look through. The second twist was worse, because it was gentler. On a dawn when fog lay across the road like a sheet, Jonah walked into the kitchen. He walked with the slow, precise gait of a man who had rehearsed being alive. He smiled, an uneven twitch, and said, "You left the light on." His voice was what grief sounded like when it learned deceit. Mara's mind zipped. Hallucination, sleep-deprived projection, a specter conjured by loneliness. But Jonah smelled of rain and old book glue. He knew the nickname for the cafe down by the river. He told her a story about a man who taught him to tie a knot when he was 10. She cried and clung to him, because holding the man who had been gone was a kind of medicine. He stayed only long enough to teach her how to fold a paper boat rust-free, how to make a mean cup of chamomile, how to speak a particular joke in their old code. He left behind a mug on the counter that had his crooked glaze. When she examined it closer, the glaze bore a scar, a hairline crack in the kiln's design that had never been there before. In other words, it was real enough to be false. The house sensed her lowering of guard. It moved in. The final act began with a thunderstorm that seemed to originate beneath the earth. The power died in a kind of ceremonial hush. The house lit itself with the blue-white teeth of lightning and the long, slow pulse of the moon. From the attic came a chorus of names, read like a ledger being closed. One by one the names were called, and for each one a window shutter clattered shut, as if the house had been bailing water. The voices coalesced at the stairwell and fretted down into the living room like smoke. Mara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the wallpaper peel itself away in ribbons to reveal bare studs, scored with symbols she now recognized from Jonah's maps, arcs and lines and a spiral that suggested depth. The deeper darkness, she realized, was not a place but a practice, the house's appetite for attention, for being fed the lives of those who could not bear to leave it alone. Jonah knelt before the hearth where embers threatened to bloom. "It wants a story," he said. "It eats endings. It likes them fresh." The voice that answered him came from everywhere and nowhere. It sounded exactly like the silence that had first woken her, the static of a radio between stations, and the tiny metallic click of a door latching. "Not fresh," it said, and the walls sighed in agreement. "Beloved." Mara understood then. The house had learned not only to mimic but to inhabit. It stitched people back into itself, but only as parts of its brevity. Each returned thing lasted long enough to be convincing, to be loved, and then the house would take it deeper, deeper than a cellar, deeper than the river that fed the town, deeper than memory. It promised to keep what it trapped by wrapping it in affection. That was the cruelty. That was the trap. She tried to run. As she turned, the front door had become a mouth of shadow and would not open. The living room seemed longer, the hallway narrower, as if the house had folded itself in a particular way that kept her inside its ribs. Jonah held out his hand, pleading with a softness that felt like betrayal. "Come with me," he said. He would not look at her as he said it, and that absence of eye contact made his face less his own. Mara's last thought before she understood the only possible way to stop it was precise and terrible. If she left, the house would follow. The knowledge rose like a draft. She had to shut whatever unmade the returning. In a panicked animal way, she grabbed the photograph of the woman, this anchor that had appeared like a stitch, and she carried it to the hearth where embers still glowed. She set the photograph onto the coals and watched the edges curl and blacken. Jonah screamed, not with anger, but with recognition, as if the sound itself unstitched him. The maps scrawled in the attic shivered as if wind had passed through them. The ledger of names tore in the middle, and the letters bled like wet ink. For a moment, a blessed, blistering second, the house unmoored. The lights went wild, windows rattled like teeth chattering in cold. Then silence, thin and caustic, fell, and where the woman had stood, the air had a hollow, as if someone had reached in and scooped space away. Jonah's face smoothed. He looked at her with real eyes for the first time, not the eyes of the house's imitation, but the depth of a man who remembered his last day and had no desire to be a pawn twice. He stepped backward toward the stair and said, "Don't," like a benediction. "Don't look back." She fled. On the porch she did not stop to look at the yard, because the yard had become a page she did not want to read. She ran until the road turned and the birch trees were swallowing the house from sight. Behind her the sound of the place changed. Not silence, but a slow, deliberate folding, like a book snapping shut. She did not stop until the town's lights pooled like sleepy eyes, and the house was a dark bruise on the horizon. Days leaked into each other thereafter. The police checked. They found nothing but a tidy house with a faint smell of smoke in the kitchen and a catalog of missing things nobody could account for. They were polite and systematic, like a band trying to seal a wound with gauze. Mara moved out, rented a room above a laundromat where machines drowned monologues, and made everything unimportant by rote. She tried to stitch her life again: work, small friends, caffeine, therapy. Sometimes in the dim of evening, she would pull the photograph ash from a matchbox and press it to the light, an ash that sometimes held a curl like a face, sometimes not. Weeks later, she received a postcard with no stamp and no return. On the front, someone had written in a neat, foreign hand, "Deeper darkness." On the back, only one line, Jonah's handwriting impossibly precise: "We are all stories, Mara. Love keeps them soft." The line dug itself under her fingernail like a splinter. She sleeps now with the lamp on sometimes with all of them burning. She knows the house will wait in its place, a patient thing that keeps scores and names and returns. She also knows that memory wants to resist being solved into neat things. At night, when the street outside her new apartment is empty and the washing machines hum like a distant tide, she feels a pressure at the back of her eyes, like someone whispering through a thin wall, and there, in that whisper, she hears Jonah's last sound. Not quite a farewell, not quite a warning, but something in between. It is the sound the house taught him, and for a little while, taught her too. An affectionate hush, promising to keep what it takes.